Oh, there we go. I'm on. Good morning, everyone. I'm Andy Serwer, the moderator, and we have an all-star panel here this morning to talk about the future of governance. And believe me, these folks are super engaged in this topic. We had an incredible conversation going into this, and we're going to continue that. They represent some of the most high-profile, prominent companies on the planet, as you'll hear, and their bios are really amazing too. I'm not going to go through them right now, but I will. Whoops, I'm off again. I will sort of weave through some of their accomplishments when I do the questions. So to my immediate left is Betsy Atkins. To her left, Jarvis Hollingsworth, Dembiso Moyo, Ron Sugar, and Mark Weinberger. Please join me in giving them a big, warm, rousing welcome. So we've got public companies, private companies, even some universities, right, Ron? That which is a real spicy topic these days.
Harder than companies.
What's that?
Universities are harder than companies in terms of governance.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they're certainly garnering headlines in the way that companies are not right now, and we'll talk to you about it. Ron's on the board of USC, just FYI. We'll just throw that in there. Betsy, why don't I start with you, though? You literally wrote the book on board governance, and so I know that you're on the board of Google Cloud, for instance, and let's just jump right in and ask you about AI, because it might not strike people that AI has much to do with governance, but in fact it does.
Good morning, everyone. I think that the velocity of change, you'll all agree, is just increasing so quickly. You know, we went through, in the 90s, we went internet, we went mobile, we went e-com, and then in 18 you had AI really take hold, and now we have generative AI. And I think that any company that isn't really leaning in on generative AI and figuring out the use cases is going to end up being left behind. You know, we saw the companies that lagged on those other macro trends not succeed. And I think for a board, it's our role to encourage management to embrace ambiguity and change, because the top performing companies are always the ones that have tech enabled early.
Great. Yeah, I mean, and of course the implications of AI on the workforce, for instance, just starting with that, you know, it's like, well, we can implement AI at our company and fire 50% of the people. Well, that becomes a board issue, isn't it?
You better upskill them. You better have an HR organization and add a position of digital upskilling director or something for your workforce.
Right. It's important to have a dialogue, obviously, amongst directors. And Jarvis, we were talking a little bit, it sort of surprises me that people consider culture at a board level to be so critical. And I know you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think so.
So, so I had the opportunity this year to serve on the Blue Ribbon Commission on governance for NACD, and it's interesting. I get a lot of questions about, you know, why the commission, and there are about 20 public and private company directors from around the country who were selected, why you chose culture. And as we talked about it, this confluence of operational, societal, all these issues challenging boards today, there's just almost a perma-crisis that boards are in. And so what we determined that if boards have to be agile, and if the board doesn't have the right culture, the ability to tackle difficult issues efficiently can be very challenging. So that's why we chose culture as the topic. And the report's available on the NACD website. It's out there. And basically it's a roadmap for boards for everything from onboarding to offboarding to the difficult director to all the other issues that boards are dealing with. Having a strong culture really is the glue that makes it all work.
Right, and that's the National Association of Corporate Directors.
Correct.
And you're on the you're the chair of the Teachers Retirement System of Texas.
Yes.
So that's and you've also been on public boards as well. What are the differences between being on a pension fund board and a public company board?
Well, probably one starts with the legislature. When you,
Oh, that.
yeah, when you chair a government agency, obviously you have to be knowledgeable of and concerned with legislation that's passed. And depending on the issue of the day for elected officials, sometimes they like to involve themselves in the board's day-to-day business. Fortunately, in Texas, we've been able to include what's called a fiduciary exception in our legislation, which means if our board determines that legislation could potentially violate our fiduciary duty to our members, we can vote and are not required to follow it. So we do have some governance around that we've been able to include in that legislation so that we can adhere to what is our highest calling, and that is our duty to our members.
Right. Dambisa, over to you. And you are on a number of very high-profile boards. We'll get to some of those in a minute, and very sort of different types of companies and organizations. You're also a member, I don't know if people know this, she's a member of the House of Lords, and we should address her sometimes as a baroness. I know, not all the time, right?
Don't be shy.
Right, exactly. And I'd love to know about governance at the House of Lords. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. But one thing we were talking about, you're an economist, talking about how the macro environment is changing so much right now, and that has obvious implications when it comes to boards and how they oversee things.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. I think it's really important to think about the sort of structural changes that are occurring around the world. So obviously, we're all very familiar with concerns around structural decline in terms of growth. There are obviously massive geopolitical concerns and instability and fissures, not just the sort of tactical ones in the short term around Russia and Ukraine, as well as Israel and Gaza, but also structurally ideological fissures that, as Betsy was hinting at there, do have reverberations into supply chains, into how we fund global businesses and how we think about tapping global resources and filling positions. So, just not just economics and not just geopolitics, but also socially. A lot of the challenges that continue to pervade the world around declines in life expectancy, concerns around the sort of post-pandemic further decline or further reduction in growth prospects for emerging markets. All of these things are things that are happening in the broader geopolitical and economic environment, but that really have a direct impact on how we govern large, global, and complex organizations. What kind of bets do we make? And also making sure that we're not sort of overly obsessed with risk mitigation and maybe don't think about investment, but continuing to balance the short term versus the long term, but more importantly, thinking about balancing the not just risk mitigation around AI and climate, but thinking about how do we invest to generate real returns over the long term.
Yeah, balancing is key, of course, with stakeholder capitalism versus just shareholder capitalism. And Dambisa, you're on the board of Chevron, and I know Ron's on the board of Chevron also. Talk about the relationship that, exists between directors. How important is that? And, something that sort of Jarvis touched on a little bit.
Yeah, so first of all, Ron put me on the board of Chevron, just to be clear. He's not just a member of the board, he's also the kingmaker. And so I'm delighted to be here with Ron. So I think I've now been on that board almost 7 years, and a lot of the things that have emerged are making sure that you have the right people in the right seats, and so we have a very mixed background board, a lot of operators, engineers, people with great business experience who've actually run global businesses like Ron has. And then we also have built sort of resilience in really challenging times. If you think about the past 7 years, we've had a pandemic, we've had a global economic crises. I joined just a few years after the 2008 financial crisis had hit, and those consequences were continuing to pervade the global economy. And so we're always thinking about geopolitical risks. I don't think I'm giving anything away here, but just 2 years ago, our board was in Israel because we had just purchased a large asset in Israel. And, there are real meaningful challenges and decisions that we've had to make given the instability that's emerged there. But we are a global business. Most of the businesses in which I serve are global and complex. And I think populating the board with people who understand different facets of running a business, but also the geopolitical and public policy aspects is really important.
All right, let's go over to the kingmaker and Ron and talk to you a little bit about, Ron, of course, is the CEO of Northrop Grumman for many years, is on a number, the boards he's on are truly remarkable, has been on Uber and Apple, et cetera, et cetera. But, you hand out some tough love, it sounds like, in terms of understanding what the board members' specific responsibilities are and how they're performing. Assessment is important, Ron.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you, Andy. So that's my payoff for past actions. Look, the board is elected by the shareholders to oversee the company, and the challenge we see now is this troubling trend of what I would call the trivialization of governance, where you see more and more rules by the numbers, that sort of thing, where ISS, Glass Lewis, and unfortunately many large institutions are making decisions on should they vote for a director, should they vote for a measure based upon what I would call second order considerations, kind of looking totally past the fact that the board of directors is the group that actually has been empowered to figure all this out on behalf of the shareholders. So with that responsibility, it's important that the board itself make sure it is in the best potential position it can to perform for the shareholders. And one of the things that I've done in my companies and I've seen done in others is to put in a self-assessment process where in each board member every year evaluates every other board member under confidence, under privilege. The information is aggregated, not for attribution. The lead director, usually has to be an independent person, provides the feedback to the individuals. Most directors are actually positively disposed to get feedback, because historically directors don't get feedback. They're such amazingly accomplished people. They got to the board for that reason. And if you think about it, if a board is going to hold its management team accountable to perform for its shareholders, it has to hold itself accountable as well. So I think a best practices where a board takes that on is the best way to go.
It's interesting, just picking up on that, Ron, when you talk about shareholder referendums, it sort of speaks to something that has occurred in society globally. You look at propositions in California, say Brexit in the UK, people want to make decisions themselves as opposed to the elected leaders or the leadership of an organization. On the other hand, some of this is valid. So how do you decide what's valid and what isn't? Say, for instance, just with shareholder resolutions. I won't ask you about Brexit.
Yeah, well, I'll give you one example that Uber faced, which is today creates more work than any other company in the world for people. There are more people operating on the Uber platform, tech platform, than the entire population of Denmark or the entire population of Singapore, almost 7 million people. And the whole model is based upon flexible work. You may like that, you may not like that. In California, a law was passed by the legislature to force basically employment and ultimately, of course, unionization of Uber drivers. And that was not what Uber drivers wanted, and that's not what the customers want, and it's not the model for the future. And so Uber had to take a very serious decision, which is we're going to undertake a ballot proposition, as everybody is allowed to by law in California, to basically put to the people the question of, is this legislative AB5 rule the one that you want to have? And one of the things which occurred is that 80% of the Uber drivers voted in favor of the proposition to stay independent, and almost 60% of the population of California did, and that actually overturned a legislative thing. That's a pretty bold thing for a company to do. It takes a lot of heavy lifting, it takes considerable resources, and you have to operate with other people who feel like-minded, and you take a lot of lightning bolts when you're doing it. But that's just an example of where a board has to think through and basically come together with management and say, this is something we have to stand for.
That's fascinating, really. I love that example. Mark Weinberger, former CEO of EY, and you're on a number of really high-profile boards also, J&J and JP Morgan, MetLife, and Saudi Aramco, which I keep harping on that just because it's just so fascinating to me. I'd really love to know what goes on there. But talk about what it's like being on these very different types of boards and the experience that you bring to bear. And, you know, is it all the same, or is it all different, or is it both?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so listen, the panel is so great. They covered a lot. You know, everyone thinks of a board the way they should. The primary responsibility is to oversee governance, to manage risk, to pick a CEO, make sure they're held accountable, interact with their stakeholders, your shareholders in particular, and the like. A really good board does that. A great board helps management see around the corner. If you think about it, the average life of a company back in the 1960s was 50 years, S&P 500 company. Today, the average life of an S&P 500 company is 15 years, and it's getting shorter. You think back of the stories of Kodak and Xerox and Blockbuster and Toys R Us, and models change, customer preferences change, your business model changes, technology changes, and you have to give the courage to management to not manage quarter to quarter, to understand and anticipate these changes and think longer term. And I view that as a really important part of the board. It's one of the reasons, Andrew, we got into this whole discussion. Unfortunately, it got mixed up with the terms ESG, which is a 4-letter word, not a 3-letter combination now. Every leader manages non-financial metrics, and if they're not, then they're not going to be around very long. That's really what E, S, and G are about. They're not related at all. And why is that so important? And why do boards, in my view, why they're all different, Andrew, to your question is, they're different at every company. At J&J, we better be doing massive research to have the next pipeline of drugs, unless we're not going to survive. Same with our med tech. At Saudi Aramco, unless we developed oil and gas that has lower carbon, ways to contain it, and alternative sources of energy, we won't be around. At MetLife, you know, you can go on, the PE firms are all getting into the insurance business. If you don't understand how they are and what they're doing, we won't be around. So when you look at these non-financial assets, again, going back to the I guess it was 1970s, 80% of the value of most companies sat on its balance sheet. My old firm, EY, made a lot of money and still makes a lot of money monitoring all these balance sheets. That's history. That's rear view mirror. That's stuff that happened. What's really fun, if you're an investor and you want to understand, you want to know what are the bigger risks that are on the forward-looking way. And those are 80% of the value of a company today in the S&P 500 doesn't sit on its balance sheet. It's patents, it's technology, it's workforce in place, it's brand, it's a whole bunch of things. Your relationship with your community and your suppliers. Things that we realize after the geopolitical things that Brosia talked about that are changing so quickly. Board members need to understand that, and that's why we don't have a good way to measure it. We don't have a good way to compare it. But at every board, to your question, they're different. And so you have to understand that.
Mark, picking up on your point, it really is our role to, as you said, see around the corner, to future-proof. And if you look at companies that really thrive and those that don't, in my observation, those that are embracing tech early are not just higher performers. You know, I served 9 years on the board of Schneider Electric, and they were the only one to buy a software company. They're a hardware culture, an industrial company competing with GE and Siemens and ABB and Honeywell. All of those deconglomeratized. They were hardware-driven cultures. They wouldn't lean into the industrial Internet of Things. They wouldn't sensor enable. They wouldn't use software. And pretty much every industry, I think, you know, we have to encourage our management teams and CEOs to sort of eat ambiguity, right? To lean in with, at this rate of change, you can't wait for all the information, right? You have to make a decision with 60% of the information or 70% and course correct, I think.
Right. Jarvis, maybe over to you, and I want to ask you, you know, working at Texas Teachers, how much sway do you try to impart on companies? In other words, are you guys doing any sort of activist stuff? And does that speak to governance as well?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And obviously, we have a responsibility to be involved. We have, 2 million members, and it's our responsibility to provide risk-adjusted returns so the state of Texas can pay their annuities once they retire. So how corporations run their companies is really important to us. And we share some of that responsibility, obviously, as we all know, with some of the proxy firms because we're so big, at about 200 billion, and we vote on so many matters that we'd have to add a staff of another 500 people to be able to do that. So we do rely on the proxy firms, but we do provide a certain level of guidance on issues that are important to Texas and that are important to our members in terms of how they vote. We have a proxy committee, and as issues arise, then we take a position on those and make sure that Glass Lewis and ISS are aware of what we think are the priorities for our members. We're probably not quite as active as some other states whose pensions actually have a corporate governance department that are very involved in direct advocacy to companies. We don't really do that. Ours is more industry driven, but we are a member of the Council of Institutional Investors and entities like that that are more industry advocates, and we ensure that they understand what we think the priority should be, and of course, we collectively decide with other LPs on how we vote on those issues.
Yeah, those social issues can get very tricky, right? In any state, right? Dambisa, I want to ask you, and by the way, some people have submitted questions. I've got the iPad, so please submit questions. If you use the QR code, you can send them my way. And I've got a question here from the audience, which is interesting. It's about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. Is it one or the other, or is it both? What do you think?
Well, I suppose maybe this is picking up on a little bit of what Mark was saying. I think if you look over time, we get very excited by fads. And so this delineation, although we can sit here and have an intellectual debate about what does it mean, how does it operate, I mean, the fact of the matter is I don't really think of successful businesses having only focused on shareholder capitalism. I think the very nature of businesses that have been around 140 years plus, like a Chevron, I was on the board of Barclays Bank, which is over 300 years old. Their very nature for them to succeed and to exist over such long periods of time through multiple world wars, through previous pandemics, et cetera, means that they do understand, and they actually don't need these proxy organizations to show up and say you need to focus on stakeholder representation. They do that anyway. They care about their customers. They care about the communities in which they operate. So I'm not really big on sort of semantics in that regard. I think ultimately these businesses are going to be judged on how they allocate resources, how do they think about managing risks, seeing around corners, as was said earlier, and basically navigating through challenge, which is not it's not a sort of given that you're going to make it. As Mark just said, there are many companies that we've known and loved in our own lifetimes that have now disappeared, and many more will disappear. And maybe just to put it into a little bit of context, I was speaking at a conference with Sequoia, which is a very successful venture capital business. And right now there's about $132 billion of capital going into venture. And they said, despite all the excitement around AI, at different points of the stack, it's going to be applications, it's going to be infrastructure. That amount of money is probably going to fund 99 out of 100 failures. There are a lot of more companies are going to fail. And there's a whole debate about who wins and what the culture of those organizations is. But I think it's really important to really think about culture being a key piece, of stakeholders and shareholders being a key piece of the success over the long term.
Mark, you wanted to jump in?
I could not agree more with what Dambisa said. And I would say this is, there is no shareholder. You got shareholders who own your stock for a minute. You got hedge funds that bet against you. You got activists that come in, and then you got institutional shareholders who are long term. And if you try and manage for every one of them, you go nuts. You can't. And I was one of those folks who was at the Business Roundtable who helped draft the stakeholder capitalism, infamous, nobody liked it, point of view. But it wasn't meant to be a bold statement. It was Alex Gorski and Jamie Dimon and Mary Barron, myself, a couple others. And none of us said we're making new ground here. We also, this is the way we operate. Long-term shareholder value is only possible if you focus on stakeholders. If you don't have people who look different than you, that mirror the customers that you have, and you don't have an inclusive environment where people can speak up and talk about, and you're not doing that, you're going to fail, period. Your long-term shareholders won't be around to even think. So they really come together. I couldn't agree more with that, but also really, really believe that the term shareholder is undefinable in many cases.
Ron?
I went through all this. Mark and I have gone back and forth on the stakeholder capitalism thing. I'm glad I wasn't in that the roundtable when it was done. But if you think about it, if you go back, I don't know how many of you have ever gone back and actually read Milton Friedman's papers from the 70s. If you read his papers carefully, he basically, I think he got it right. He said, look, the purpose of a company is to make money for its owners responsibly. Because if you don't do it responsibly, you won't ultimately sustain yourself, and that'll be no good for the owners. And so I think that we can't forget the fact that with whatever fads come, with whatever new buzzwords, whatever three-letter initials, at the end of the day, there will be a reversion to the mean. Companies that figure out how to create value sustainably and responsibly are going to be around, and those that somehow get off the track or don't create value but do all the right three-letter words are not going to be around.
Yeah, go ahead.
They get into trouble, companies, I think, when they lose their main focus on their vision, their mission, their values, and they start to opine too much on social and political issues. Then you lose focus, you divide your employees, you divide your customers. Unless you are an authority and it's core to your business to speak out on a social issue, I think that the downside risk is more than the upside.
Yeah, go ahead,
Can I just say
Dambisa.
one other thing, because I'm sure people are thinking about what to go and read next or how to think about this. There's a wonderful book, which many in here will probably know, but I think it's a really important reminder. It's by William Thorndike called Outsiders, which actually I think Warren Buffett, but many others really love. But the key point that comes out of that book is that companies that succeed over long periods of time generate returns above the cost of capital that are significant, that really outperform not just their own sectors, but outperform the market, are businesses that are doggedly focused on capital allocation. Sure, there's all this other stuff that we have to do, but I think, and I'm sure my colleagues here on this panel will agree, that we've seen, certainly over the past decade, many CEOs be distracted by the political issues, social issues, that takes them away from what their ultimate and fundamental responsibility ought to be, which is around allocating capital in a disciplined way to generate the returns that I think Milton Friedman was touching on. I actually did read Milton Friedman's document. I think he's been done a very unfair injustice. I'm sure he's rolling in his grave, and it really is an artifact of the world that we live in, that we move away from the things that make companies successful. Some of the things that Mark was talking about. A lot of companies are delisting, as we know, the statistics around the number of companies that no longer want to be public, and it's a great shame and ultimately a big cost to society when those things happen. And I think it's ultimately because businesses are being forced to move further and further away from allocating capital in a disciplined way into dealing with a lot of the social issues and political issues for which we're not really au fait, and we're not being hired for in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, you have shareholders or employees demanding that CEOs or boards issue a statement on subject XYZ, which, to your point, Dambisa, has nothing to do necessarily or only tangentially to the company's core business. And that gets very hard. But then you have to say no, and then those constituents say, well, you don't care. You're not a caring
There's
CEO.
a good exercise companies can go through where you collectively create a policy. The board creates a policy and reviews it with management, or management creates it, really. Management creates it. The board reviews it, opines on when will we speak, when will we not speak. And when management does that with the whole employee base, then they get the chance to participate. Management can say, hey, these are the values, these are the core things, this is why we'll speak, when our voice is valid. And it's one of the ways to, help your new Gen Z employees and millennial employees who think that they trust their companies more than any other organization, according to the Edelman Trust survey.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted. I could not agree more. And we have some great guidelines for the CEO and when to speak, when it's related to your core values. But when you have a Jamie Dimon as your CEO, it's really hard. They don't follow the list sometimes. And so you do get to start talking about things. The problem when that happens, I mean, it's very positive sometimes, but the problem is, if you talk about one thing then the next group that comes along and say, okay, we don't do that, but you talked about them, what about us? And so you start down a very slippery slope. And so I do believe, as Betsy said, whatever you choose to talk about, don't get the political side and talk to your people about it. If you want to talk about voting rights, give them the day off to vote. Help them vote, do things like that. You don't have to get involved in the legislative process because half the people will like it, half will hate it, and you can't win.
You got Jamie Dimon, Mark Benioff, and it's God love them, but it's hard. Once you put yourself out there, and you guys are on the board, you see your CEOs doing that, you're like, right?
Yeah, I think the best advice I give my CEOs is your personal opinion is very important, your values are important, but you are basically representing the company and its shareholders. So if the opinion you are expressing is consistent and directly aligned with the value and the mission of the company, that's an okay thing to do in general. If it's not aligned with that, or if you have a personal view of this and that, then you need to stay away from it. I'm thinking about some of the real challenges where at Google, for example, a number of years ago, several thousand engineers discovered that Google was actually working for the United States government and providing service in artificial intelligence and others to help find, identify, and catch terrorists. And that particular group of engineers thought that was an evil thing to do because people could get hurt. And therefore Google should not be doing it. And as a result of that, they kind of rose and created a situation where the leadership of Google had to actually step back from and rescind the contract with the government, at least for a while. It's been changed. But it's a very tricky dynamic where the people who are working for you have very strong opinions, and there are Slack channels inside of every company, and you have to be somehow able to balance that. The trick is to try not to get in a situation where you get out in front of what are the basic core values of your company.
All right, Ron, I got to go there because I'm just so curious. Can you talk about USC at all? I mean, and what's going on? I mean, you're on the board there, and talk about agitation and then responding. It's not easy. I feel for college and university presidents and boards because it is incredibly difficult. I look at Columbia University, and the president there is hated or disliked or been chastised by both sides of the issue, which either means she's doing a great job because both sides don't like her, or she's doing a bad job because both sides don't like her. I don't know.
Someone once asked me after I graduated from my day job running Northrop if I might want to take on a university because I have some academic background, and it occurred to me that job was about 10 times harder than the one of running an international corporation with 130,000 employees. I think rather than speaking to USC, let me just speak more generally because this is a national situation. I think we have a tradition in this country, because we're a free country, of free expression, of people opportunity to raise their voices when they see something, and that's very important, that's very healthy. If you don't have that, you have Russia, and you have other kinds of circumstances, as you know. The borderline, I think, for all the universities is when it moves from free speech and free expression in an orderly and respectful way to harassment, where it goes to intimidation, where it goes to destruction of property, where it goes to blockage of access, that really crosses a line where you're beyond free speech. And I think most universities, in one way or another, are kind of looking at that as kind of the red line that you don't want to go across. And it's a tough problem because you want to balance all sides. But I think to your point, it's very difficult to be a university president today at any university in America.
Great, thank you. I want to ask Mark, can you talk a little bit about Saudi Aramco and what goes on in that boardroom? I'm just so curious. Again, obviously there's a lot of private things that happen, but maybe you can talk generally about what that's like and how it's different from maybe a board here in the United States.
Well, sure. None of my comments are forward-looking information, so no, it's interesting. It's an international. It went public in 2018. I went on the board after it went public. It follows international accounting standards. It's been a great experience to help, frankly, develop. I chair the comp committee to help put in systems that I've learned in the Western world in terms of how to operate. Very well, the board members there are the former Dow and CEO of Dow and DuPont, the former CEO of Sunoco, the former CEO of BP. So there's all people who've come from different environments who are bringing their management and governance capabilities. The difference is you have a shareholder that owns 90% plus of the company. So it's actually, in some ways, easy to have long-term value perspective. You are not having people come in as activists and say, let's go ahead and try and get the stock up today. They are looking very, very long-term. They have a 2030 plan, they have a 2050 plan. And the role of the company is to diversify into lots of different areas. So, it's been an incredible learning experience. I've been confirmed by the Senate twice. I worked for 4 presidents. I did worry because of the history of Saudi. What do you do? Am I ever going to get confirmed again? I went to talk to my friends in the Senate and in the State Department. Said, will I ever be confirmed again? They said, maybe not. But they basically said, and as we see it now, and Mike Milken said this yesterday at one of the sessions, there's probably no more important place to be right now than to help where that Middle East pivots, east or west, and the national security interests that we share, and the common enemies of Iran, and the normality of Israel and the rest of Arab nations where Saudi's played a big role. There's a huge positive moral issue for me, in addition to my governance, that I want to try, and I've always been someone who'd rather be in the room trying to fix things than outside the room complaining. And so it's been a tremendous experience and a very, very strong, capable board.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Jarvis, you went to West Point and you're a lawyer, and I'm wondering if you bring those experiences to the board and to your executive management skills as well. And do you see people doing that, bringing their background, saying, well, when I was at the Navy Academy, not that you'd listen to someone who would say that, but wondering about that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I think you're seeing now a number of boards that have invited former military officers. I think the training that we get at the academy, the training that we get, and our experience in leading troops, especially in combat situations. I'm sure many board members will say, sometimes, given what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it's a battle. Many times between the board and the C-suite, many times between different shareholders and different aspects of supporters. So we're seeing more and more retired military officers being invited to serve on boards. I think just about all the major banks now have a retired general who's on their board, and I think they serve a really important role. We have a process in NACD called From the Battlefield to the Boardroom, where it's a 6 or 9 month process where education is provided to former military officers who are making the transition to corporate boards and how they can contribute based on their experiences.
Right. Betsy, I want to go over to you and ask you about Wynn. You're on the board of that company, and the board's had to restructure a little bit. There's been some turmoil, some management turmoil there. What has that process been like, and how are you seeing the company moving forward?
It was an interesting process. I came in after Steve Wynn exited, and over 80% of the board turned over. And Elaine Wynn brought a hostile proxy action of an activist. She held 9%, making her the 3rd largest shareholder. So it was very interesting to have an all-new board come together and cohere. And you've heard my really talented colleagues. It's about building a board culture where you process as a team, where you build trust, where you're actively listening and kind of thirsty for each other's views. And it's been a very different board. We've brought, for example, we want to change the cohort of our customer from a baby boomer and a Gen X. We need to capture the millennial and Z customer. So we brought in a gentleman from the entertainment industry in his 30s to bring us cultural relevance and a window into, what are the new cool nightclubs? What are the cool restaurants? How do we get the vibe? How do we make it relevant? Because, it's what Mark and others were saying. Your company will asymptotically melt or be gone even more quickly if you're not reinventing it. So it's been great because it's been people from all different backgrounds coming together. But our chairman, who's a fabulous guy, Phil Satre, who was formerly president of Harrah's, he's a great chairman, as I know Ron is, where he weaves everybody's view in. And he really makes sure that all the different, there's debate and discussion. and there's different views, and we actually don't agree on a lot of things, but we're never disagreeable. So it makes for very interesting dialogues of what you were saying, Dambisa. Where should we put the capital? Should we, invest in regional gaming, which is like the Hard Rock, or should we do high-end destination? Should we go overseas? We're opening a new place over in Dubai, which is amazing that we can do gaming in the Emirates. And should we go to Thailand or should we go to New York? Where's the growth? So it's a big debate because these are, $3-4 billion capital investments over multiple years.
All right, Elon Musk was here the other day. He may still be here. He may be sitting in the audience. I don't know. But I'm curious as to what you guys would think if you were on his board. Okay, he gets paid a lot of money, sometimes smokes weed on podcasts, buys Twitter, says whatever he wants. Ron, you have any thoughts? I'm going to you. I'll go to Ron. We'll pick on Ron for that one.
Well, I've met Elon. I don't know him well. I would say it creates a little bit of a challenge relative to traditional governance boundaries.
Right.
But I'd say you get the opportunity to self-elect. And remember, there is a control factor in the company, which is that this is not widely held, and all the people of the world get to have this is fundamentally a controlled company, and a major portion of whose value is not the balance sheet, as Mark mentioned, but it is, in fact, the amazing genius and energy and the investment that people are making in what the future might be. And so all the attributes that he brings, whether you like them, whether you don't like them, that's the whole package. So I would say that being on that board is not for everybody. Mm-hmm. And it would certainly not be necessarily the first choice for a governance stickler. On the other hand, if you step back and you say, this is an interesting journey, and I think he said once in a quote, he said, look, I'm putting men on Mars, I've created electric cars, I've changed solar panels, I'm doing this, I'm implanting stuff. What did you expect? A chill dude who's going to just be warm and fuzzy? And so you decide what you want to get, and you do it if you want to. And as I said, it's not for everybody.
But it's so interesting what you said, Ron. I think you nailed it when you said people are investing in the genius of the founder. And I think when you think about all of the boards we've served on and you in the audience, there's like three archetypes of a CEO, right? There's the founder CEO who's special, unique. You look at Bill Gates, you look at Elon Musk, you look at, Mark Zuckerberg, right? So you'll tolerate, expect some unusual behavior. And not all founders scale. So as a board, you have to figure out when that founder is really hit the wall. And then there's the professional CEO, like at Wynn Resorts after Steve Wynn, Craig Billings. He's an amazing CEO, really sharp and very future oriented. And then I think, maybe I wonder what you guys all think, I think the bulk of the CEOs are in the custodian category, where they're not being dynamic, they're defensive, they're not looking to growth, they're not offensive. And I think those are challenging. Those three types give you very different boards.
Right. What makes our country great, our capitalist system great, is that we've got an amazing salad bowl of different kinds of vegetables and fruits, right? and if you want the steady return and you want the guy or the gal who minimizes your maximum regret over time and gives you the safe dividend but not a whole lot of growth, you invest that way. If you want to take a shot, you do that, and you can make an asset allocation of your personal account or your institutional account or your pension account accordingly. And I think that's the joy of the capital system in this country. So I'd say it one size does not fit all, and you basically decide what you want and you do it. And as I said, if you're more into formalized governance, that's not your board.
Right, so. Right. Dambisa, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about government and boards. And you said that increasingly companies are off sides with government at this point, just because of all sorts of trends, which I want to ask you about. So I want to ask you about that, and then how does being on the House of Lords fit in? I mean, is that a governance function of the British government, or do they have governance at the House of Lords? We're kind of ignorant here, at least I am, in the United States.
So maybe just to give I'll start with the second one first.
Yeah,
if I
okay.
may. So just to give a bit of few bullet points, the House of Lords has its origins in the 11th century. And just to a bit more color, today there are about 700 members. I would say about 300 active members. It's basically the equivalent of the Senate, except all the members are appointed by the monarch, so we're not elected. And as such, it has a very interesting makeup. It has all the Supreme Court justices are in there, the head of MI5, MI6, which is like the CIA, FBI, are in there, a head of the National Health Service, you get the picture. And so it's been quite interesting. Oh, I should say, for people who are interested in the sort of ESG aspects, the first women entered in 1958, first black person in 1970. And right now, I could tell real interesting tales. We're dealing with 2 cases of transgender peers and thinking about how to admit them into the process because of some of the sort of technicalities from way back when, centuries old, around hereditary peerages. So it's in a whole other conversation, but suffice it to say, it's self-governed in many ways. So once we're appointed, we're considered peers of the monarch. We have meetings to discuss all the different aspects we've been talking about here about what does the country look like in the future, how do we think about risk mitigation, thinking about national security, growth, as you might expect. Of course, it is challenging because being an expert is become kind of a dirty word. Certainly around Brexit, it became quite a dirty word. And so if really the off-balance sheet value of the House of Lords is around expertise and goodwill and thinking about complex issues, that's been devalued in a world where everybody has opinions and more sort of misinformation, etc. But notwithstanding that, we do operate, we make decisions, we're voting constantly, and much like a corporate board, we do think about risk mitigation as well as investing for the future. I can't really remember what your first question was. But
just about being offsides from the government.
Yeah, look, I think that it's a real problem. I, like Betsy, wrote a book called How Boards Work around the challenges that corporations have to deal with in navigating this sort of, these big issues, AI, climate, et cetera, slow growth. But straddling not just the profit motivation, but being dragged into dealing with a lot of the social issues. And I think what has happened, unfortunately, to my mind, is that government and third sector, so NGOs, became offside. They're dealing with the same issues. They're dealing with energy transition. They're dealing with issues around AI. But they decided, mainly because of their own mandate, to be offside from what corporations what stance corporations were taking. And maybe a specific example of this would have been a number of years ago in one of the global conferences in Europe. They were having a big discussion about the energy transition, but they didn't have corporations represented there, or certainly they were being more heckled and run out of time. But in any case, I think that world I think we've moved on a little bit from that sort of us versus them world. I hope that's the case. I think things have gotten so challenging that now we see much more integration, public acceptance that we need all sides, all hands on deck, so government plus corporations plus NGOs. I think it feels like that conversation is getting a little bit better than it was a few years ago.
Great, thank you. Mark, I want to ask this question to you from the audience. Since you served in government a bit, its question is, do you think the governance of our country should be different than the governance of corporations? Example, board refreshment, term limits, mandatory retirement, etc.
Aren't we out of time? My third time is it here?
Easy.
Yes, I think it should be different. I do. I mean, as Ron was talking about earlier, you're a shareholder, you get to choose what type of company you want to invest in, what your risk tolerance is, what your values or morals may want to be for that company you're investing in. If you're a citizen of the United States of America, you're buying into being a citizen of the United States of America. There's certain responsibilities and requirements that go beyond personal preference. And I think that, I'm not a believer in term limits. I think we have term limits, elections, and I've seen, having worked for, as I said, 4 different presidents, worked in the Senate for 6 years, there's bureaucrats who get a bad name, who are absolutely brilliant, who work and run our government, keeping things moving, whether it's national defense, whether it's at a local level, police, other things that I wouldn't want shareholders voting on all the time, every 2 different years. We can disagree with what we have. The old saying, we may have the worst system except every other system in the world. I believe that everyone wants to live in the United States of America for a reason. I think we got a great country, and I wouldn't try and challenge the 4 founders on having a new governance structure.
Absolutely. Ron, I want to ask you about Apple, and just another amazing company you're on the board of. How much credit does the board get? Is it all Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, or you guys?
Actually, the board is responsible for pretty much everything.
Yeah, I thought
at Apple.
This is the inventor of the iPhone right here? No.
Yeah, so I joined the board 15 years ago when Steve was still with us, and it's been a remarkable run. And when Steve passed, there was a lot of consternation about the board is not doing its job because it's got to find a new leader. And oh, by the way, there's no new Steve Jobs. Well, the fellow we have now is named Tim Cook. It's been over a decade now. The market cap of the company is probably 14, 15 times greater than it was when Steve was last with us. And it shows you that you have different horses for different courses. Nobody could have done what Steve Jobs did, either his first tour or his second tour running Apple. And I would argue that Tim Cook, I can't imagine a better CEO than his. And the company just came out and announced a $110 billion share repurchase. That's the largest share purchase ever announced in history. And I think it's a reflection of the value proposition the company is offering. And it's not like people are forced to buy iPhones or Macs or to go on to iCloud. It's that it's a marketplace decision made by millions and millions of people around the world every day. And I will tell you that in that company, like every other company, the team wakes up every morning figuring out, holy cow, what's the competition doing? What's the new technology? How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I protect cyber? How do I deal with AI? And I'd say the role of the board is to make sure, I think, as was said by one of my colleagues, to get 3 things right. Get the leadership right at the time, to make sure the strategy the leadership is following is right, and finally, to make sure the company is operating with a risk appetite which is appropriate for the shareholders who own the company. And that's really our job, but 99% of the credit goes to the team that's actually doing the work.
And are you the longest standing board member at this point at the company?
I am not. I've been on the board almost 15 years. I think I might be the second longest.
And just quick follow-up, what was that handoff like? I mean, when Steve was sort of turning things over to Tim and you guys got sort of comfortable with Tim Cook, what was that like?
Yeah, well, Tim Cook had been in the company for many, many years. And people don't recall that when Steve had bouts of serious illness and had to take leaves of absence, we had Tim in there running the railroad. I would say Tim was not somebody who aspired to be Steve Jobs, but was asked to serve and has done an absolutely fabulous job for the company and its shareholders.
I mean, Tim Cook is one of Steve's greatest accomplishments in terms of being able to identify a successor, because a lot of people suggested that when he was gone, that would be the end of the company, and that was
there were a lot of shorts out there on Apple at that point in time. But I will say, as a CEO, you really have a couple of duties. One is to leave the place better than you found it, and secondly, to groom a successor or two that will do even better than you've done. And you see the CEOs who are, iconic CEOs, and they leave and the company sputters and they get called back in to save their company, and then they leave and then it sputters again. I'd say that's not an example of success.
Right, and it's when you create such a strong culture the way Steve did, it gets hard, and Tim's done an amazing job. I was at Berkshire Hathaway last weekend, and the culture that Warren Buffett has created is amazing, and the Woodstock of the weekend and all that. Yeah. It'd be very interesting to see. I mean, Greg Abel is going to be the next person in that seat, but to be able to carry that on and carry that through is going to be a huge lift for him.
Yeah, and can you imagine what he's thinking about now as he's preparing to take that on? It's a tough and a daunting task.
Yeah, it is daunting. Betsy, a question for you, which is, how has the director role changed over time today versus, say, 20 years ago?
It's changed hugely. You can even go back to the WorldCom, Enron, catastrophic meltdowns of 2000, where all of a sudden you had to have an executive session at the end so the directors could speak unsupervised without management in the room. And you'd say, what's the opportunity? What's the risk? What do you think? And coming out of that was, those discussions was, hey, let's have a strategy offsite where we can do a deeper dive and really understand with management the underlying assumptions and, the operating plan going forward. So we've become more engaged in understanding strategy. And I think the role now really is, I was listening to some of the things you were saying, Ron, and you mentioned, competition. I think increasingly with the velocity of change and the number of innovative new business models, like who would have thought of a marketplace, 25 years ago before eBay created it. So external focus now, I think, is increasingly important. Leaning into change and willingness to take risk, I think, is going to be increasingly important in the boardroom. And I wonder what, everybody else thinks.
Yeah, I would, the regulatory environment obviously is very, very different. I mean, you've got a very active Department of Justice who've, changed the definition of, what it means to be a fiduciary. You've got the SEC that's really undergoing evolution right now with respect to public companies and their responsibilities. So the regulatory environment is a big change probably over the last 10 years. And if you look at some of the litigation that's come out of the state of Delaware, which is where a lot of companies are, incorporated, they've really transformed a lot of the traditional fiduciary issues to say boards, you're a lot more responsible. We're watching what you do. So I think boards, from a governance perspective, you're seeing more written procedures. You're seeing minutes reflect that we talked about these important issues, so the board can show that it really is being a responsible fiduciary. So I think litigation and the regulatory environment has also changed.
Absolutely. Dan Pisa, go ahead. Yeah,
Maybe
and
I'll
then
just
Mark.
say two quick things. So
Yeah.
one is that the very nature of uncertainty and complexity, I think, makes it harder to forecast. I think that's kind of a truism. And so I think there will be more challenge around what's the horizon for which boards think about the company. I think there's been shorthand thinking about long-term strategy, and a lot of the day-to-day tactics is left to the management. But I think our horizons are getting shorter. We have to make decisions about debt and how much leverage are you going to have this year, because we're going to have, in 6 months we have elections, et cetera. So I think that's just one example. But the point just being, I think that there's some changes in horizon. And the second point is the deglobalization, the geopolitical environment means that we also have to really road test this notion of a global company. This idea of borrowing cheap in New York and London and investing for higher returns in Brazil and South Africa, I think that model is going to be under severe challenge. And so again, does that mean we're going to be running organizations that are centralized in New York or London, and you have these decisions that are in terms of procurement and management that are global, or are we going to be much more siloed in how we finance our businesses, how we operate these businesses, and think about long-term strategy?
Mark, I'll let you have the last word.
I'm going to go back to where I started. I said that, there's good boards, very good boards, and then there's great boards. And as Ron talked a little bit about, there's good directors and great directors. I get asked a lot, technology, you have to have a technologist on your board. You can't have an expert in everything. You can't. I mean, you got 11, 12 people, you got a lot of issues. But technology is everything. Technology is a regulatory issue. Technology is a business model issue. It's a consumer issue. It's a geopolitical export control issue. So you as a board member have to learn all these issues. And so I would say today the difference is a board member needs to learn a lot more. You didn't stop learning when you were CEO of your last company or CFO or whatever position you had, and to stay relevant, you have to understand brand new issues, and that's a big challenge beyond the risks.
We are going to have to leave it at that. I think this is an awesome conversation. Thank you so much, panelists. Please join me in thanking them.